are back for another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. That means we are on to chapter 2. Just as a quick reminder of chapter 1 here, we learned in this story we have 6 adults. We've got Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. Then we have Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. Then you have Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. Mr. Bucket has the wonderful job of screwing on toothpaste caps once the toothpaste is full. And then you have Charlie Bucket, and they all live in this small home. There's only one bed. And poor Charlie, he only gets a chocolate bar once a year on his birthday. But unfortunately, he lives right by a giant world famous chocolate factory, Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and he has to smell that chocolate every day. So here we are, we're going to learn more about it. Looks like Mr. Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. That's the title of this chapter. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they laid huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening, and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they all looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, and the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I know he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was clever." "Clever!" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down, and said, "Absolutely true, just as true can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter of me." "Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and this is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different scent, each bar sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in an ice box?"